The polished glass doors slid open, and Adrian Miller stepped inside with grease still under his fingernails. Sloane Whitaker looked him over, once then said it loud enough for the whole floor to hear. "This showroom isn't for people like you." She didn't know Vivian Crawford was standing just outside, frozen at the sight of the battered work truck idling at the curb. The CEO's hand pressed against the glass. She knew that truck. She had nearly died in it 10 years ago. Every head turned toward Adrian, and the past began to collect its debt. The morning began, the way every morning began for Adrian Miller, with the smell of motor oil and cold coffee. He worked at a small garage on the edge of town, a low brick building with a hand-painted sign that had faded to the color of weak tea. He had owned the place outright for 6 years now, ever since the previous owner retired, and sold it to him for less than it was worth because the old man trusted him. People in town trusted Adrian. That was a thing he had earned slowly, the way he earned everything with his hands and his patience and his refusal to cut corners. He was 38 years old, and he looked it in the way honest work made a man look it. There was gray coming into his hair at the temples. His knuckles were thick and scarred from decades of slipped wrenches. He moved without hurry, because hurry was how mistakes got made, and he had learned long ago that a careful man finished first in the end. The customers who came to him knew this. They knew their cars would leave his lot running better than the dealerships could manage, and for half the price, and without the lecture. Adrian had buried his wife 4 years earlier. Cancer, the slow kind, that gave a person time to say goodbye, and took that time as its own cruel payment. He did not talk about it. He kept her photograph on the dashboard of his truck, and a second one on the workbench, and on the days the loneliness pressed hardest, he simply worked longer until his body was too tired to feel anything but the ache in his shoulders. The garage was his anchor. The truck was his memory. Between the two of them, he had built a life that asked for nothing and gave back exactly what he put in. The truck was the thing that mattered most, though no one looking at it would have understood why. It was a battered work truck, 15 years old, the paint gone chalky and the bed dented from 1,000 hauls. The passenger door still bore a long crease, where something heavy had folded the metal inward. Adrian had never fixed that crease. He could have in an afternoon, with parts he had on hand. But he left it exactly as it was because of what had happened the night the metal bent, and because some scars were meant to be kept. He had been driving home late on a rain-soaked highway 10 years ago now, when he came around a curve and found wreckage scattered across both lanes. A car had spun off the shoulder and rolled into the ditch, crumpled like a discarded can, its headlights pointing up into the falling rain. Other vehicles had slowed, but kept moving the way people do when they are afraid of what they might be asked to do. Adrian had not kept moving. He had pulled the truck onto the shoulder, left the engine running and gone down into the dark and the mud. There had been a woman inside. The roof had buckled and pinned her, and the smell of gasoline was thick enough to taste. He never let himself think too long about the math of those minutes, how close it had been, how a few seconds either way would have changed everything. He had used the truck and a tow chain to pull the wreck enough to free her, and then he had carried her up the embankment and laid her in the truck bed because the cab was too small to keep her flat. He had driven her to the hospital himself, faster than the truck was ever meant to go, while she drifted in and out beside him. He never learned her name. By the time the doctors took her through the doors, the panic of the night had blurred everything, and he had not thought to ask. He had given his statement to a tired officer, and gone home and showered the mud off, and gone to work the next morning, because that was what a man did. The crease in the passenger door stayed. The memory stayed. And the woman, whoever she was, became a quiet certainty he carried. The knowledge that on one night, his life had counted for something that could not be measured in money. That was the truck Adrian drove into the city under a low gray sky one Tuesday in late spring, because he had finally decided, after 4 years of telling himself he did not need anything, that he would buy himself a new vehicle. Not for show. The old truck was tired, and a man who fixed engines for a living knew better than anyone when an engine was nearing the end of its honest life. He had saved carefully. He had the money in full. Sitting in an account, he had built one careful deposit at a time. He did not intend to finance anything. He intended to walk in, choose something dependable, and pay for it like the grown man he was. The dealership rose out of the commercial district like a cathedral of glass. Crawford Motors, the sign read in brushed steel letters, the showroom floor visible through walls that were nothing but window-lit from within, so that the cars inside seemed to float against the overcast light. Adrian parked the old truck at the curb because the lot felt too clean for it, and he stood for a moment looking at the building, aware suddenly of the oil under his nails and the worn places at the knees of his jeans. Then he told himself that money spent the same no matter who carried it, and he went in. The door slid open with a soft mechanical sigh, and the cold, conditioned air met him like a wall. Inside, everything gleamed. The floor was pale, polished stone. The cars sat on it, spaced like sculptures, and the people moving among them wore suits that cost more than Adrian made in a month. He stood just inside the entrance, taking it in, looking for someone who might help him, and he watched the faces turn toward him and then turn away, the way faces do when they have already decided you are not worth the turning. A young salesman near the back caught his eye. The man's name tag read, Daniel Reyes, and he had started toward Adrian with the easy step of someone who meant to do his job when a woman cut across the floor and reached Adrian first. Her name tag read Sloane Whitaker, and she carried herself like the showroom belonged to her personally. She stopped a careful distance away, as though proximity itself might dirty her, and she looked Adrian over from his boots to his graying hair with an expression that did not bother to hide itself. "Can I help you?" she said, and it was not a question, and it was not an offer. It was a thing said to make a person feel the door behind them. "I'm looking to buy a truck," Adrian said. His voice was even. "Something new. I've got a budget set, and I know more or less what I want. I won't take up much of your time." Sloane's mouth curved into something that was almost a smile and was not kind. "I think," she said, "that you might be more comfortable somewhere else. We have certain clients here, certain expectations." Her eyes went past him to the curb, to the battered truck sitting there with its chalky paint and its creased door, and something like distaste tightened her face. "This showroom isn't for people like you." The words landed in the cold air and seemed to hang there. A couple browsing near a sedan glanced over and then pretended they had not. Daniel Reyes, who had stopped a few feet away, shifted on his feet, his jaw working as though he wanted to speak and could not find the standing to do it. Adrian felt the heat climb the back of his neck, the old animal heat that wanted him to raise his voice, to plant his feet, to make this woman take the words back. He had felt that heat many times in his life. He had learned just as many times what it cost to obey it. He did not raise his voice. He stood where he was, and he let the moment settle. And when he answered, he kept his tone level and quiet, the way he spoke to a frightened animal or a stripped bolt that wanted patience instead of force. "I think you've made an assumption," he said. "I came in here to spend money, same as anybody. I'm not asking for a favor. I'm asking for a salesperson." The calm seemed to bother Sloane more than anger would have. Anger she could have used. A man shouting was a man she could have asked to leave a security situation, a story she controlled. A man standing quietly and reasonably in his work clothes, asking only to be treated like a customer, gave her nothing to push against. Her smile thinned. "Mister, I don't think you understand," she began. "I understand fine," Adrian said. "You decided what I'm worth before I said a word. I've had that done to me before, and it's never once been right." He let his gaze move slowly around the showroom, taking in the floating cars, the polished stone, the careful people who would not meet his eyes. "I'll wait," he said. "I've got time, and I've got the money, and I'd rather buy it here than drive another 40 miles. So I'll wait until somebody's willing to do their job." Daniel Reyes took a step forward, then his voice low and a little unsteady. "I can help him," he said. "It's no trouble, I'm free, I can just— You're not on this!" Sloane cut in, not looking at the younger man, her eyes still fixed on Adrian. "Get Gerald." The name carried weight on the floor. A few seconds later, a heavy-set man in a charcoal suit came out from a glass-walled office at the rear, moving with the unhurried confidence of someone who had not been told no in a long time. Gerald Voss was the floor manager, and he had the soft, even tan of a man who spent his money on appearances. He took in the scene with one practiced sweep, the work clothes, the standing customer, the salesgirl, with her arms now folded, and he arranged his face into the patient mask of authority, arriving to restore order. "Is there a problem here?" Gerald said. It was the same not question Sloane had used, passed down like a family trait. "No problem," Adrian said. "I'd like to buy a truck. Your employee here decided I couldn't afford to be in the building. I'm telling you I can, and I'd like someone to show me what you've got." Gerald's gaze flicked to the curb, found the old truck, and Adrian watched the man do the same arithmetic Sloane had done, watched him reach the same wrong answer. "Sir," Gerald said, and the word was sanded smooth of any respect. "I'm sure there's been a misunderstanding, but our inventory here runs on the higher end. I'd hate for you to feel pressured into something that isn't suited to your situation. There are some excellent dealers across town who carry pre-owned, more in the range that might— You don't know my range," Adrian said quietly. "Neither does she. Nobody in this building has asked me a single question about what I can spend." He kept his hands loose at his sides, kept his breathing, even though he could feel his pulse in his ears now. "I came here to give you my business. I'm still willing to. But I'm not going to stand here and be told I don't belong because my clothes have honest dirt on them." For a moment, something passed across Gerald's face, a flicker of uncertainty, because there had been a steadiness in Adrian's voice that did not match the picture they had drawn. But the picture was easier than the doubt, and Gerald chose the picture. His expression hardened back into polished dismissal. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave," he said. "We reserve the right to serve whom we choose. Sloane, would you walk our visitor to the door?" Daniel Reyes made a small sound of protest, half a word, and Gerald silenced him with a single look that promised a conversation later. The young man's face went red, and he stared at the floor, and Adrian understood that the boy wanted to do right and did not yet have the standing to pay for it. He felt a flicker of something almost like sympathy for him, caught here in a place that would teach him the wrong lessons if he stayed long enough. Adrian did not move toward the door. He stood his ground, not in defiance exactly, but in the simple refusal of a man who knew he had done nothing to deserve being put out. "I'll go," he said evenly. "I'm not going to make a scene in your nice, clean showroom, but I want you both to remember this. I walked in here with cash in hand and good faith, and you threw me out over a pair of work boots. That's going to mean something someday. Maybe not today, but someday." He let the words sit, and then he turned slowly with the unhurried dignity of a man who had decided the leaving was his own choice, and not theirs. He took one step toward the doors, and another, the cold air, and the soft light, and the floating cars all sliding past him, the couple by the sedan watching openly. Now Daniel Reyes frozen in his shame, Sloane already turning away as though the matter were closed. What none of them saw, what Adrian himself did not yet see, was the figure standing just beyond the glass doors at the front of the showroom. A woman in a tailored dark suit had come up the front walk, a moment before, her steps slowing, then stopping entirely. Her eyes locked not on the people inside, but on the battered work truck parked at the curb. She had gone very still. One hand had risen without her seeming to notice, and pressed flat against the cold glass fingers spread, as though she needed the support of it. She was looking at the long crease in the passenger door. She was looking at the chalky paint and the dented bed and her face had drained of color, and her lips had parted around a breath she did not seem able to finish. 10 years fell away from her in the space of a heartbeat. 10 years and a rain-soaked highway, and a smell of gasoline, and the rough warmth of a stranger's hands lifting her out of the dark. She knew that truck. She had spent a long time trying to find it, and a longer time making peace with never finding it. And here it sat at the curb of a building with her own name on the sign. Vivian Crawford stood outside her own showroom with her hand against the glass and watched through the reflection and the bright interior light as a man in work clothes was being walked toward the door of the company she had built. And though she could not yet see his face clearly, though 10 years had blurred the particulars of that night into a single unbearable feeling, something in her went cold and certain, all at once. The doors slid open. Adrian stepped toward them, and on the other side of the threshold, the woman whose life he had carried up an embankment a decade ago took her hand from the glass and waited for him to come through. The doors slid shut behind Vivian Crawford as she stepped inside, and the cold air of her own showroom met her like a memory she had been running from. She did not announce herself. She rarely did. She had built the company on the habit of arriving quietly and seeing what people did when they did not know they were being watched. So she stood near the entrance half in shadow, and she watched the man in work clothes stop a few feet short of the door he had been walking toward. Adrian had felt the air change. He turned his head expecting the salesgirl behind him, and instead found a woman he did not recognize, standing very still by the entrance, looking at him in a way that made the back of his neck prickle. He did not know her face. He noticed only that she was studying him as though she were trying to fit him against some picture she carried, and that whatever the picture was, it had taken the color out of her. Sloane noticed her a beat later, and her whole posture changed in an instant. The folded arms came down. The sneer smoothed itself into something bright and eager. "Miss Crawford," she said, the warmth flooding into her voice, "we weren't expecting you on the floor today. We were just handling a small matter, nothing that needs your—" "What matter?" Vivian said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried the way a quiet voice carries when everyone in a room has already decided to listen to it. Gerald Voss came forward smoothly, sliding into the space between his employer and the problem, his manager's instinct working faster than his sense. "A walk-in, Miss Crawford. We were directing him toward a dealership better suited to his needs. Nothing to trouble yourself over. I'll see him out and we can—" "His needs," Vivian repeated. She had not taken her eyes off Adrian, and now she came a few steps closer, crossing the polished stone, her heels making no apology in the silence. "And what did you determine his needs to be, Gerald, in the 4 or 5 minutes I assume you spent with him?" Gerald's confidence faltered at the edges. He was a man accustomed to reading a room, and the room had shifted under him without his permission. He came in regarding a vehicle, but it became clear that our inventory wasn't aligned with his circumstances, and rather than waste his time— "Did he tell you his circumstances?" Vivian said. "Or did you read them off his boots?" The question landed flat and merciless in the cold air, and for the first time the showroom was genuinely completely quiet. The browsing couple had stopped pretending to look at the sedan. Daniel Reyes stood very straight near the back wall, watching his employer, with an expression that was equal parts terror and hope. Sloane's bright smile had begun to curdle, because she could feel the ground tilting, and did not yet understand which way it would slide. Adrian, for his part, said nothing. He had spent his whole life learning when to speak and when to let a thing reveal itself, and every instinct he had told him to stand still now and let this play out. But he watched the woman, and the prickle at his neck grew stronger because there was something in the way she looked at him that was not about the argument at all. She kept glancing past him through the glass at the truck. 10 years ago, Vivian said, and her voice changed when she said it, dropping out of the cool register of command into something raw. "I was in a car that left the road on the highway north of here, in the rain. The car rolled into a ditch, and the roof came down, and I was pinned, and I could smell the gasoline, and I lay there in the dark, and understood very clearly that I was going to die there, and no one was going to stop. Cars slowed down. I could see their lights, and then they kept going, all of them, because it was inconvenient and frightening and not their problem. No one in the showroom moved. Adrian had gone very still, the heat draining out of his face, now a different cold replacing it. One person stopped. Vivian went on. One man in a work truck who came down into that ditch in the mud and the rain. He used a chain to move the wreck off me. He couldn't fit me in the cab because I couldn't bend. So he carried me up the embankment and laid me in the bed of his truck and drove me to the hospital himself faster than that truck had any business going. The doctor said another 15 minutes, and there would have been nothing to do. Her eyes had not left Adrian's face. I never got his name. By the time I could think clearly enough to ask, he was gone. I spent 2 years trying to find him. The police report had a name I couldn't read, and a plate that traced to nothing. In the end, I gave up. I told myself I would never know who he was. Obubor, she lifted one hand and pointed, not at Adrian, but past him through the wall of glass to the battered truck at the curb. That truck has a crease in the passenger door, she said. Long one folds inward just behind the handle. I was lying against it when he drove me into the city. It's the last thing I remember clearly before the hospital. I would know it anywhere. The silence that followed had a different quality than the silence before. Gerald Voss had gone gray under his careful tan. Sloane's mouth was open, and no sound was coming out of it. And Adrian felt the floor of the moment drop away beneath him because he understood now all at once who the woman was. And the understanding was so large that for a moment he could not hold it. "It's you," he said, and the words came out rough. "I never knew if you made it. They took you through the doors, and nobody would tell me anything because I wasn't family. And I went home and told myself, you must have, but I never knew." He looked at her, this woman in the tailored suit, standing in her gleaming showroom, and he tried to find in her the broken thing he had carried up an embankment in the rain, and could not, and then could. "You made it. Because of you," Vivian said. "Every day for 10 years because of you." It would have been a clean moment, a moment of recognition and grace, except that the situation it had landed in was anything but clean. And Vivian Crawford had not built a company by letting hard things resolve themselves softly. The warmth went out of her face as she turned it toward Gerald and Sloane, and what replaced it was something colder and more dangerous than anger. "So, let me make sure I have the order of events correct," she said. "The man who saved my life walked into my building today with money in his pocket wanting to buy a truck, and the two of you took one look at him and decided he was beneath the privilege of spending it here. You told him this showroom isn't for people like him." Her gaze moved from Gerald to Sloane and back. "Did I get that right, Miss Crawford?" Gerald began, his voice unsteady now, all the polish stripped from it. "We had no possible way of knowing." "That's exactly the point," Vivian said. "You had no way of knowing. None of us ever does. We never know who the person in front of us is, what they've done, what they've survived, what they're carrying. So we are supposed to treat them decently anyway. That is the entire idea. You didn't fail because you couldn't see who he was. You failed because you decided his worth without looking, and you would have done it to anyone who walked in dressed like they work for a living." Sloane found her voice at last, and it came out thin and pleading. "I was just trying to protect the brand, the clientele. I thought I was doing what you'd want." "What I want," Vivian said, "is for you to stop talking." The words were not loud. They did not need to be. Sloane's mouth closed, but the conflict was not resolved, because Adrian, who had been listening to all of it, who had felt the tide of the room turn entirely in his favor, did something none of them expected. He stepped forward, and he raised one scarred hand, not in anger, but in a kind of quiet refusal, and he spoke directly to Vivian. "I appreciate what you're saying," he said. "I do, and I'm glad past everything that you're alive and standing here. But I need you to understand something." He held her eyes. "I didn't come here to be rescued. I came to buy a truck and pay for it with my own money like any man has the right to do. And I won't have this turn into charity. I won't take a free truck because of what happened on that road. That night wasn't a transaction. If you hand me keys now to make this right, you make it a transaction and you take the one clean thing I've got and put a price on it. I'd rather walk out empty than let that happen." The words seemed to strike Vivian somewhere deep, because for a long moment she only looked at him, and the hard line of her jaw softened. Here was the second barrier, and it was not the one she had expected. She had expected to fight the people who had wronged him. She had not expected to make peace with the man himself, with his refusal to be turned into a debt repaid. And some part of her recognized that this refusal was the very thing that had probably made him stop on that road in the first place. "I hear you," she said slowly. "And I won't insult you with charity. You have my word. But I'd ask you to let me make this right in a way that isn't a handout, because what was done to you in this building was wrong regardless of who you turned out to be, and it would have been just as wrong if you were a stranger off the street. Will you give me that? Not a gift, just a fair chance to do business with you and to deal with how you were treated." Adrian considered her, and the consideration was real because trust did not come easily to a man who had been judged on sight more times than he could count. He looked at Gerald, who could not meet his eyes, and at Sloane, whose face had collapsed into something small and frightened, and at the young salesman Daniel Reyes standing against the back wall, with his hands clenched at his sides. Then he looked back at the woman whose life he had once held in the bed of a dying truck. "I'll let you do business with me," he said. "Fair business. I pay full price for whatever I drive out of here. That's the only way I'll do it." His voice hardened just slightly. "And I won't pretend the last 20 minutes didn't happen. That part's between you and your people. I won't tell you how to run your house. But I won't shake hands and act like it was nothing either, because it wasn't nothing. Not to me, and I don't expect it was to that young man back there who tried to help me and got told to sit down." Vivian's eyes moved to Daniel, and something registered in them. "No," she said quietly. "It wasn't nothing." She turned then to Gerald and Sloane, and the temperature in her voice dropped to its lowest point yet. "Both of you in my office. Now, Daniel stays on the floor." Gerald made one last attempt to save himself, his hands spreading in appeal. "Ms. Crawford, I've run this floor for 6 years. My numbers are the best in the region. Surely. One mistake." "It isn't one mistake," Vivian said. "It's the mistake you'd make every single day if no one was watching, and today I happened to be watching, and today it happened to be the man who saved my life. How many days were there that I wasn't watching Gerald? How many people walked in here and got the same treatment, and just left and never said a word? That's what you've made me think about." She turned away from him, as though he had already ceased to matter. "My office, both of you." The two of them went Sloane first, with her head down, Gerald behind her, moving as though the floor had turned to ice. The browsing couple gathered their things and slipped out murmuring to each other. And the showroom, which a few minutes earlier had been a place built to make a man like Adrian feel he did not belong, settled into a strange, charged quiet, the cars gleaming under their careful lights, the polished stone reflecting the overcast sky, coming through the glass. Vivian stood facing Adrian across a few feet of that polished stone, and the distance between them was full of 10 years, and a rainstorm, and a debt that neither of them quite knew how to name. She drew a slow breath and steadied herself, the executive reasserting control over the woman who had nearly come apart at the sight of an old truck. "You said you won't take charity," she said. "I respect that more than you know. So I'm not going to offer you a truck. But I am going to offer you something else, and I want you to hear me out before you tell me no. Will you do that? Will you give me the chance to say it?" Adrian regarded her for a long moment, the wariness still there, but underneath it, something willing to listen. He thought of the garage on the edge of town, and the photograph on the workbench, and the long years of being measured by his boots, and his truck, by people who never once asked his name. He thought of the young salesman who had tried to help him and been silenced, and he thought of this woman, alive and breathing in front of him, who was the proof that one night in the rain his life had counted for something. "I'll hear you out," he said. "That's all I'll promise, but I'll hear you." Vivian nodded, and for the first time since she had stepped through the doors, something that was almost a smile touched the corner of her mouth, tired and grateful and unguarded. Beyond the glass, the old truck sat at the curb in the gray light, its creased door catching the reflection of the building with her name on it. The past and the present, holding their breath in the space between what had been done and what came next. The office Vivian led him into was all glass and clean lines, looking out over the lot, where the new trucks sat in their rows. She did not sit behind the desk. She took one of the two chairs near the window and gestured Adrian into the other, putting them on the same level, and that small choice told him more about her than anything she had said on the floor. Through the wall, he could see Gerald and Sloane waiting in a smaller room across the corridor, their figures stiff and miserable behind the glass. For a moment, Adrian sat with his scarred hands resting on his knees and felt the full weight of where he was. The morning had begun with cold coffee and motor oil, with the simple plan of buying a truck and driving home. Now, he was sitting in the office of a woman whose life he had carried up a muddy embankment 10 years ago, and the ground under everything he understood about himself had shifted. He was not a man who liked being seen. He had spent 4 years since his wife's death, making himself small and useful and invisible, and now he was the most visible thing in the building, and it pressed on him like a hand against his chest. "I want to be honest about something," he said before she could speak. "This is hard for me, being looked at, being the story." He turned one hand over, studying the old scars across the palm. "For 10 years that night was mine. It was the one thing I knew about myself that nobody could take or argue with. I never had to explain it to anybody." He lifted his eyes to her. "Now it's out in a room, and people are going to make it mean things, and I don't know how to feel about that. I'm not sure I wanted it found." Vivian listened without rushing to fill the space he left, and when she answered, her voice was lower than it had been on the floor. "I understand that better than you'd think," she said. "For 10 years it was mine too. The thing I couldn't explain. I run a company with my name on the building, and every quarter someone writes that I'm hard, that I'm cold, that I built all this by being ruthless. And the truth I never tell any of them is that I almost died in a ditch, and a stranger in work clothes decided I was worth stopping for, and that's the only reason any of it exists." She held his gaze steadily. "So I won't make your night into a story for other people, but I won't pretend it didn't happen either. There has to be something between burying it and putting it on a billboard." The honesty cost her something, he could see that, and the cost made him trust it. He nodded slowly and let the tightness in his chest ease by a degree. "Then say what you brought me in here to say," he told her. "You asked me to hear you out. I'm hearing you." Vivian leaned forward, her forearms on her knees, the executive and the survivor folding into one person. "I have a service department in this building," she said. 11 bays, the largest in the region. And it is run, frankly, by people who are very good at billing and not very good at honesty. And I've known that for a while, and I've done nothing about it, because it makes money. And I told myself that was enough. Her mouth tightened with something like self-disgust. Today, I watched what my own people do when they think no one's measuring. It made me sick, and it made me think about who I'd actually trust to run a thing like that. Someone who does the work right when there's no reason to. Adrian saw where she was going, and the old wariness rose in him. I have my own shop, he said. 6 years. I own it free and clear. I'm not looking to come work under somebody. I'm not offering you a job under somebody, Vivian said. I'm offering you the service operation, to run it. Your terms, your standards, your name on the door if you want it. Full pay that reflects what it's worth, which is a great deal more than they're paying the man running it now into the ground. She watched him carefully. And before you say no, hear the rest. This isn't because of the ditch. I want to be clear about that, because you asked me not to make it charity, and I'm holding to it. I'm offering it because I spent 20 minutes watching you stand in a room full of people deciding you were worthless, and you never once raised your voice, and you never once gave up your dignity, and you told 2 of my managers the truth to their faces with more steadiness than anyone in this building has shown me in years. That is the person I want running my service floor. The ditch is how I found you. It is not why I'm asking. The distinction mattered to him, and she had clearly understood that it would, and the understanding itself was part of what made the offer real. Adrian sat with it. He thought of the garage on the edge of town, the faded sign, the photograph on the workbench, the long, quiet years he had built there, one careful repair at a time. He thought of how it would feel to walk away from a thing he had made with his own hands. And he thought, too, of how small that shop had become around him, how it had stopped being a life and started being a place to hide from one. I can't just abandon my shop, he said. There are people in that town who trust me with their cars and have for years. I won't leave them with nothing. Then don't, Vivian said. Keep it. Run it however you want. Hand it to someone you trust. Fold it into what we'd build here. I don't care about the logistics, those we can solve. I care whether the man across from me is the man I think he is. She straightened. I'm not asking for an answer today. I'm asking you to think about it. And whatever you decide, you're walking out of this building today in a truck you paid fair price for, because you came here to buy one, and you have every right to, and no one is going to stop you this time. That part isn't an offer. That part is just me getting out of the way of a customer. Something in Adrian came loose at that, some long-held knot, and he let out a breath he felt like he had been holding for 10 years. He did not answer about the job, not yet, because he was not a man who decided his life in a single afternoon. But he found that he wanted to. He found that the wariness for once was quieter than the thing underneath it, which was the simple wish to matter again, to be useful in a way that meant something, to come out of the small, invisible place he had built for himself. Before any of that could be settled, Vivian rose and crossed to the door of her office, and her attention turned to the 2 figures waiting across the corridor. She opened the door and called them in, and Gerald Voss and Sloane Whitaker came, their earlier confidence entirely gone, standing now like people awaiting a sentence. I've made my decision about both of you, Vivian said, and there was no cruelty in it, only a flat finality. Sloane, you're done here, today. You looked at a man and decided his worth from across a room, and you said it out loud in my showroom, and that is the one thing I will not carry on this floor. Clean out your desk. Gerald will walk you down. She turned to the manager. And Gerald, you're not fired, because the truth is, you didn't create this. You just stopped caring enough to stand against it, and that's a different failure. You're suspended without pay for 30 days, and when you come back, you report to whoever I put over the service floor, and you are going to relearn how to treat a person who walks through those doors. If you can't, you'll follow her out. Am I understood? Gerald's jaw worked, and for a moment it looked as though he might argue the old self-importance flickering. But he looked at Adrian sitting quietly by the window, and at Vivian's unmoving face, and the fight went out of him. Understood, He said the word small. He turned to do as he was told, and Sloane followed him out with her eyes on the floor, and the matter as far as the company was concerned was closed. When they had gone, Vivian called Daniel Reyes in from the floor. The young salesman came nervously certain he had done something wrong, and he stood twisting the cuff of his sleeve. "Daniel," Vivian said, and her voice gentled. "You were the only person on that floor who tried to do the right thing, and you got told to sit down for it, and you sat down because you didn't have the standing to do otherwise. I'm giving you the standing. You're being promoted effective today, and the man you'll be learning from if he says yes is sitting right there." Daniel's face went from fear to disbelief to a kind of stunned gratitude, and he looked at Adrian as though he had been handed something he had not dared to want. Adrian looked back at the young man and at the woman and at the lot full of trucks beyond the glass, and he understood that the afternoon had built something around him, whether he had asked for it or not. The choice was still his, but the shape of the life on offer was clear now, and it was a life that wanted the very things about him that had gotten him thrown out an hour before. "I'll think about the job," he said to Vivian. "Honestly, that's not a no." He stood, and his knees ached the way they always did, and the ache was familiar and grounding. "But I came here to buy a truck, so let's start with that. Fair price, no discount, no favors. I want a receipt like anybody else." A real smile broke across Vivian's face, then the first full one, and it took years off her. "Daniel," she said, "go sell this man a truck, full sticker. He insists, and don't you dare try to talk him into anything he doesn't want." They went down to the floor together, and Adrian walked the rows with the young salesman. And he chose a truck, the way he chose everything slowly, and with his hands checking the engine bay himself, listening to it idle, asking the questions a man asks when he intends to keep a thing for 15 years. He paid in full the money he had saved, one careful deposit at a time, and he took the receipt and folded it into his shirt pocket, and it felt different from anything he had ever bought, because he had bought it as a man who belonged in the room. When it was done, he went back out to the curb where the old truck still sat in the gray afternoon light, its chalky paint and its creased door catching the last of the day. He stood beside it for a while, with one hand resting on the dented bed. Vivian had come out with him, and she stood a respectful distance away, understanding without being told that this was a private thing. "I should sell it," Adrian said, not really to her. "It's done its work. The engine's near the end. A man who fixes engines should know better than to keep one past its time." He ran his thumb along the crease in the passenger door, the long fold of metal he had left unrepaired for 10 years. "But I'm not going to. I'll fix it up enough to keep it running and park it where I can see it. Some things you don't keep because they're worth money. You keep them because of what they carried." Vivian came to stand beside him then, and she looked at the inside of the door she had seen in 10 years of dreams. And for once, she did not have anything to manage or decide. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Not for the company or the offer or any of it. For stopping. For coming down into the dark when everyone else kept driving. I've wanted to say that for 10 years, and I never thought I'd get to." "You don't owe me thanks," Adrian said. "I'd have done it for anybody. That's the whole point of it." He looked at her, and something settled between them even, and clean two strangers, bound by a single night, who had finally been allowed to close the circle. "But I'm glad it was you. I'm glad you went and built something with the years I helped you keep. Makes it mean more knowing that." He got into the new truck, and it started clean and quiet, and he sat for a moment with both hands on the wheel and the receipt in his pocket, and the old truck in his mirror. He did not yet know if he would take the job, though he thought now that he probably would, because the small, invisible life he had built no longer seemed like enough to go back to. What he knew was simpler than that. He had walked into a place that told him he did not belong, and he had not raised his voice, and he had not surrendered 1 inch of himself, and in the end, The room had been made to see him. A man's worth was never in his boots, or his truck, or the dirt on his hands. It was in what he chose to do when no one was measuring on a dark road in the rain, with every reason to keep driving. That had always been true. The only thing that had changed on this gray afternoon in late spring was that for once, the world had been made to admit it. Adrian put the new truck in gear, took one last look at the old one, and drove home.